Chapter 6. School Scandals. I was not particularly rebellious during my years at Marlborough College. I didn't really smoke or do drugs as some of my friends did, and was never caught having sex behind the cricket pavilion, largely because I never had any sex. The ways in which I got into trouble with the school authorities were far more unusual. One of the oddest situations came about thanks to my interest in art. I loved the subject, and one of my best friends, Freddie, studied it with me. A bit of a player, Freddie was dating one of the fittest girls in the school, a busty young temptress called Flo, who was very pretty, but also very chaste. To date, she'd quashed all of Freddie's eager attempts at amorousness. Their relationship amounted to little more than being awkward together in public, and one occasion where Freddie had grasped a handful of breasts that he'd timed at 13.5 seconds. As well as being Freddie's best mate, I was also his wingman. An unrewarding gig that consisted of standing around at parties as he got off with the most attractive girl there, while I spoke to her wingwoman, who had no intention of killing time with anything more exciting than stilted conversation. "I want to do a painting of Flo naked," Freddie confided in me one lunchtime. "You know, like in Titanic, life modelling." "Great idea, mate. Make sure you show it to me when you're done," I replied, with the haste of a teenage boy who wouldn't let an opportunity to see nudity in any form pass him by. "No, I need your help, Jack." Brilliant, I thought. Here he is, thinking of his best mate. Why should he get all the fun? He wants me to, hold his palette or clean his brushes, allowing me to cop a cheeky glance or two at the fittest girl in the school naked. What a great friend. "I want you to pose naked first," Fred explained. Text speak didn't really exist back in 2003, so I couldn't say WTF. Instead, I just goggled at him. "I'll draw you, then I'll draw her," Freddie explained, gathering from my expression that the idea struck me as a little left field. "That way, I can convince her that it's a legitimate art project." "You're not going to show her a picture of me naked, are you?" I stammered. "I'll have to. I'll probably have to use it in the exhibition too, just to make sure, you know." The exhibition was an end-of-year thing where teachers and parents and pupils alike milled around being polite about the art students' paintings on display. The very idea of my ass being critiqued by the headmaster was already making me sweat.
Ass? What's ass? We're not in America. It's bottom.
Sorry. Okay, my bottom being critiqued by the headmaster. "No way, Fred. But it's the only way I'm going to get her kit off. You've got to help me, mate. Do you want me to die a virgin?" "You're not a virgin." "Well, I feel like one. Posing for me, everyone will be like, 'Oh, Jack, he's arty, he's edgy, he's naked?'" There were so many holes in Freddie's logic. But he was very persuasive. And he was my best friend.
Nudity is a recurring theme in your life. I seem to remember we had some other dealings with the second master when his wife caught you completely naked in the middle of a field, allegedly making a film of what type I can only imagine.
An art film.
When out walking their dog. I, on the other hand, have always been a man who does not display his body in public, or indeed in private either. As you know, I always wear pyjamas in bed, apart from, of course, when your mother and I are making the beast with two backs.
Oh my God, that's enough. Let's continue with the story, please. The room Freddie chose... Oh God, sorry, I can't get that. The beast with two backs. Just give me a moment to get it out of my head. Oh God, I'm going to be sick. Okay, right. Let's just continue. The room Freddie chose was a secluded one in the art block. We went there on a Saturday afternoon while everyone else was playing sports. It was deserted, but worryingly cold. "Fred, you know the way portrait painters throughout the ages have been expected to flatter their subjects? Please don't make my dick look small."
This would have been quite beyond Freddie's artistic talents. As you well know, Jack, you have been fortunate in inheriting from me very generous proportions in that department.
Oh, God.
Something for which you should be very, very grateful.
Oh, right, okay. I took off my school uniform and got onto one of the tables, which didn't look like it had been cleaned in a while. "Just hurry up, mate. I'll knock this one out quickly. Flo's coming in an hour." "Two things, Fred. One, please don't use the phrase knock one out in this environment. And two, you promise I can stay and keep guard at the door when you do the picture of her?" "Yes, mate, of course," Fred said as he started sketching. We spent ages in that room. Being a life model is one of those jobs where you have a lot of time to think. And think I did, mainly about how weird this situation was. Freddie found it awkward too, but at least he had his drawing as a distraction. Then I heard footsteps. Flo was coming down the corridor. Shit, I thought. She's going to come in here. I don't want her to see me naked. Fred's one thing, but not her. Not in person. My clothes were on the other side of the room, so it was too late to go for them. Trying to look my best. That's the only option, I thought. I puffed out my chest, sucked in my stomach and slung the old boy over my thigh. "Don't move, you idiot," said Freddie. The door swung open. "Hello, Flo." Ah, it was Mr. Parling, the head of art. A small, squat Damien Hirst lookalike with a passion for architecture. Parling surveyed the scene. I could kind of understand his surprise. There was something very D.H. Lawrence about the whole thing.
I can't believe that you've read any of D.H. Lawrence's books. Which one are you referring to here, then?
The film with Oliver Reed and Alan Bates. I haven't read any of them. I tried to style it out, holding my ground. After all, what's unusual about a man sketching another man naked? It was 2005, after all. Sure, we didn't say WTF yet, but we were pretty advanced in other ways, right? YOLO. No one spoke for a while. Mr. Parling remained very calm. "Put your clothes on, Whitehall," he said, without raising his voice. He glanced for the first time at the drawing. "The proportions are all wrong. For a start, that is far too big."
Parling clearly wasn't wearing his reading glasses.
Shh. Freddie told me he had pointed at my foot, but to this day I have my suspicions. Also, feet are proportionate, so it amounts to the same thing. Freddie never did get to see Flo naked. After the story of our homoerotic tryst got round...
You mean tryst, don't you?
Yeah, that's what I said. Tryst. After the story of our homoerotic tryst got round, things dried up for a while. Unfortunately, the story made it all the way back to Putney, and I had to field a rather tricky call from my parents a few days later.
"Naked, eh? With another boy?"
said my father.
"Is there anything you want to tell me, Jack?"
No.
"It wouldn't shock me, you know. I've met a lot of men who bowl from the pavilion end in Theatreland."
Jesus, Dad. There was whispering at the other end of the phone.
"Your mother wants to ask you something."
He handed the phone over. I tensed up, expecting to receive an earful.
"Where is the drawing? I thought it might look rather nice in the guest room."
It's at moments like this when I see how my parents work as a couple. My father may sound eccentric, but I suspect my mother is actually the mad one.
How dare you question your mother's sanity? There are very few people who would want a picture of you in the buff, let alone want to put it on display. You should be so bloody lucky.
The school's mock election was another incident where I had some explaining to do to my father. It was the first school election I'd been involved in at Marlborough College, and never one to shy away from the opportunity to show off. I was desperate to get involved. Each pupil taking part would have to do so under the banner of one of the parties running in the general election that year. I went to see the organising committee to see what the deal was. They informed me that all the major parties had been taken as I was late in applying. Patrick Stansbury, a bad-tempered, pus-faced prefect who wore a double-breasted suit with shoulder pads covered in dandruff, a Timmy Twinkle in the making, had already bagged the Conservative Party candidacy. Of course he had. The Monster Raving Loony Party was also popular, and Lucy Pebble was going to represent the Green Party. "All the parties have gone," said one of the committee, in a tone that suggested he was more than happy to see me sit this one out. "Oh, wait, no, there is one party left," said a girl sitting next to him. Brilliant. A lifeline, I thought. "Who?" I asked. "Veritas." Who the fuck are Veritas, I thought to myself. "Ah, of course, Veritas! My family have been voting Veritas for years," I said, trying to impress the girl. It didn't work. "I'll take them." The boy on the committee looked annoyed as he wrote my name down among the other candidates. A quick search in the computer labs later told me that bronzed former daytime TV talk show giant Robert Kilroy Silk was in charge of the party. I took down what little information I needed and printed out some blurb. There was a hustings the following morning at break where each candidate would get up in front of the school and explain why they should be voted in as the school's Prime Minister. No actual power came with this post, it was more of an exercise in debate. Nevertheless, it was a competitive event. I knew I had to get noticed at the hustings. I needed to make an impact. I needed inspiration. Where was I going to find it? I looked down at the printer, and lo, it shat out a picture of Kilroy. I came back from Boots with enough fake tan to drown half of Essex. In the bathroom of my boarding house, I dabbed some on, but it didn't seem to be working. I added more and then more, but still nowhere near the complexion of Kilroy. Damn, maybe I'm immune to it, I thought to myself, as I tried on some garish tie options and practiced my best shit-eating, bigoted grin. A few hours later, it had begun to take effect, and by the time I went to bed, I looked like Mark Wright.
Who the hell is Mark Wright?
I woke up looking like Ian Wright.
Who are these people?
No one had informed me that if you don't wash fake tan off, it develops. By the time I'd got to the hall where the hustings were being held, it had got even darker. My friends tell me it noticeably deepened during my actual speech, and by this time I wasn't the only one whose skin was changing colour. The headmaster's face had gone from pink to red. He was sitting next to Marlborough's MP, Michael Ancram.
Ah, finally. I know Michael Ancram, a very fine and respected old Amplefordian, and indeed the Earl of Ancram.
Yeah, whatever. Michael Ancram, who was also looking a little taken back. After the speech, I was marched off to the sanatorium to receive an industrial scrub down, and once again my parents were informed. The email they received went as follows. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Whitehall, we regret to inform you that disciplinary action has been taken against your son. During the school's recent mock elections, Jack took what was clearly intended as a bit of fun a step too far and appeared in the Memorial Hall hustings wearing so much fake tan that it was racially offensive.
And you blame me for being racially offensive with voices, and you were doing that physically.
Yes, but this was a mistake. This was a mistake.
Headmaster wrote a letter to me.
It was a mistake, and it was an email, not a letter, because people don't write letters anymore. Like my father's touchline ban, it was yet another first. I am the only boy in Marlborough's illustrious history ever to have received a formal caution from the school for blacking up. My mother was devastated. My father, worryingly amused. A Veritas spokesman being racially offensive, eh? He mused. I mean, it feels entirely appropriate. This is one of the greatest things about having the father that I do. He's always able to see the lighter side of any situation, even when I fucked up majorly. I'd always get shouted at, but it wouldn't be long before he was able to have a laugh about it. The thing he seemed most annoyed about on this occasion wasn't the fake tan, but the fact that I wasn't running as a Conservative. The most trouble I ever got into at school, though, was also politically motivated. It was during my final year at Marlborough, and some friends and I had all developed into young firebrands. We hated the establishment, read The Guardian, and drank fair trade coffee whilst we discussed how ashamed we were of our privileged backgrounds.
If I ever catch you reading that socialist propaganda again, I shall disinherit you.
Even the posters on our dormitory walls had changed. The half-naked girls were torn down and replaced with slogans saying Free Tibet and Tony Blair. We were no longer interested in frivolous things. We were grown-ups now. A year ago we were excited about being at the same school as James Blunt's sister. Fact. Now we were thrilled about being at the same school as Anthony Blunt, the communist spy. Fact. It was at the height of the Iraq War, and we radical sixth formers wanted to make a statement. We held a clandestine meeting in the common room to hatch a plan.
I see you've been at my thesaurus again.
A stunt that would stick 2 fingers up to the man. We don't need no Marlborough education.
Oh, Jesus, and now we've got double negatives creeping in. I give up.
It had been a long journey to get to this point. I was never particularly politically active. In fact, the only time that I'd previously been involved in any kind of protest was when I attended the Countryside Alliance March in London during my second year at school. Marlborough had a lot of influential parents who were very pro-fox hunting.
Not to mention their own pack of beagles. A fine dog, the beagle. although the males can be very, very randy, as I discovered when I was involved with the Ampleforth College pack.
What the fuck are you talking about? The school said that anyone that went on the Countryside Alliance March would be granted a day off. I checked my diary, saw that I had a couple of science lessons in the morning and decided I'd go along for the ride.
Just to reiterate, I never want to see or hear of you reading The Guardian again.
Yeah, okay, I get it. I get the point. The way I saw it, man landed on the moon almost half a century ago. So if some village idiot still can't make a hutch capable of keeping out what is essentially a fancy dog, then they deserve to find the mangled corpses of their chickens in the morning. However, I kept this to myself. I may not give much of a toss about foxes, but the kids on the coach were very passionate about hunting, so whatever. Did you know, Jack, there are more names on the pro-fox hunting petition than there are on the one to ban it? Said a sixth form boy who was so posh he sounded as though he was in pain. No, I didn't, I replied politely, thinking to myself that there were more names on his petition because all of them were double or triple-barrelled. Once in London, we plodded up and down the streets of Westminster, getting very odd looks from Londoners who perhaps thought their city was being invaded by an army of gentlemen farmers. "Killing the fox is a sport," blubbered an arse-faced man in corduroy trousers next to me. Is it? I mean, not really. The fox never wins. If at half-time they swapped round and the posh man on the horse was taken off it, stripped, given a bin liner full of old bits of food and then chased through the fields by a pack of hungry foxes, then yes, it could be considered a sport. But fox hunting in its current format is a little one-sided. "What do we want?" the marchers chanted. To get off double physics, I thought. It was an awful day, after which I decided that protest wasn't for me. But the times, it was a-changing, to misquote Bob Dylan, something I did quite a lot at that time. Tony Blair had lied to us about WMDs, and now our army was butchering innocent Iraqis. So as my friend Giles Bouvard shared around the contents of a cafetiere, we plotted how to get our voices heard.
Although this chapter's a bit lefty for my liking, I'm delighted to see a fair bit of Blair bashing.
We decided that our target should be the Combined Cadet Force, or CCF, a risible bunch who dressed up like soldiers to practice marching in a car park every Wednesday afternoon. The Army's equivalent of community support officers. They made the TA look like the SAS. We decided to attack them outside their barracks whilst they were on their weekly parade, and we plotted this attack down to the last minutiae in the style of 17th century Catholics. "Each of you must go back to your boarding houses and gather more rebels for the attack," said Giles as he laid out some dark chocolate ginger biscuits on a bone china plate. "We pounce covertly and then bombard them with water bombs, bags of flour and anything else we can lay our hands on," said another conspirator, adding some honey to his chai. We'd get across our pacifist message through an act of unprovoked violence. It was brilliant. The brothers in arms I'd selected for the task were my friend Harry Von Bear, a keen cricketer with a good arm, and Alex Lavarello, who was in the dormitory next to me. We made ourselves makeshift balaclavas out of beanie hats, and, on the day of the attack, skived off games to go and meet the rest of the gang.
It's beginning to sound more Millwall than Marlborough.
The assault itself was a blistering success. The CCF didn't know what had hit them. For boys with aspirations towards a military future, they were utterly pants at defending themselves. We were in, out, 5 minutes, tops, and none of our group was taken prisoner. A triumph, we thought. That was until the next day. The CCF's parade ground had been fitted with CCTV cameras. The act of cowards, if you ask me. And Alex was called into the second master's office to be shown the footage. Now, I can't take responsibility for the reason our identities were rumbled, but I had certainly made one major error of judgment in the lead-up to the attack. Yes, our balaclavas covered our faces. Yes, we were covert. Yes, the evidence was disposed of with all the efficiency of a tabloid journalist who'd been tipped off about a police raid. There were no trails back to us, no smoking gun. However, there was just one tiny problem. Alex Lavarello, whom I'd brought in, was 18 stone and over 6'4" tall. You could fit 2 of me and a Harry Von Bear inside him. As he watched the footage back with the second master, he realised no balaclava could have hidden the fact that it was clearly him, lurching around the CCF's parade ground like a rhinoceros in a burqa. "I know it's you, Alex," he said bluntly. "You will give me all of the names of the boys involved in this attack, or I will expel you." Poor Alex. Luckily for his sword, he didn't fall on it. He gave all the names. It was time to call my parents again, and this time explain that a suspension was heading my way for what was described as a premeditated act of terrorism. My father gave me an almighty bollocking, but then a few hours later called me back to tell me that he'd drafted a letter to send to the second master. In it he called him a petty little man and claimed that of all the people who should have been able to cope with an attack, it was the CCF. I told my dad it was probably best if he didn't send it, and he reluctantly agreed, though it was nice to know that he'd got my back, as I gather Mr. Lavarello was slightly less understanding.
I reluctantly decided not to send my stinging letter to the second master, as I had a very rare twinge of sympathy for him. This was due to the fact that the whole incident had been witnessed by a visiting conclave of prep school heads who were holding a conference at the college and had stumbled unwittingly right into the middle of the attack. And just to reiterate, I never, ever, ever want to see or hear of you reading The Guardian again.
Yes, Father.
Part 3, Going Wild in the Country. Chapter 7, Invite at Your Peril. Although one of the actor Martin Jarvis's main claims to fame was being the voice of just William, there was no excuse for Jack to behave like William when we were invited to lunch at the Eaton Terrace home of Martin and his wife Roz. And not just any old lunch, but Christmas Day lunch. Hilary, who was pregnant with Barnaby at the time, and I were joined by several other guests, including the radio presenter Nigel Rees. The house was decorated to within an inch of its life, as was the Christmas lunch table, and the dress code was appropriately formal. Even Jack was required to wear a bow tie. Nigel Rees was wearing an elegant grey suit and a pale yellow silk tie, which he announced had been a Christmas present from his wife that morning and had cost a fortune. Jack and Molly were the lone children in a party of 7 adults, and Jack was sitting between me and Nigel. After a smoked salmon starter, which Jack managed to get not only all over his bib and hands, but all over his face and up his nose, we proceeded to the dish of the day, an enormous turkey with all the trimmings. Jack was served first and tranched into his gravy-covered lunch with great enthusiasm, quickly abandoning the children's knife and fork provided by Roz in favour of his hands. At this point, Nigel made an attempt to engage the feral Jack in a little light social conversation while he waited to be served. "Do you like Christmas?" asked Nigel. Jack, who was playing with a very slippery Brussels sprout, ignored him and pushed the sprout into his mouth, accompanied by a handful of mashed swede mixed with bread sauce. "I bet you got some nice presents," Nigel continued. "This tie was a present from my wife. Do you like it?" At which point Jack stopped eating, and with 2 hands dripping with a mush of turkey, gravy and cranberry sauce, violently grabbed Nigel's tie and started pulling it. "Tie, tie," he giggled, as the knot got smaller and smaller and tighter around Nigel's neck. In an effort to avoid asphyxiation, Nigel attempted to prise Jack's dripping, greasy hands off him, but in so doing managed to splash his immaculate jacket with the detritus from the tray on Jack's high chair. Having removed his hands, Hilary manhandled Jack and his high chair over to the other side of the table as he repeated, "Tie, tie," at the top of his voice. On the way home, Hilary reminded me of a Sunday lunch a few months earlier when we had driven to North London to my lawyer, Brooke Land, and his wife Anita's house. Jack was about 10 months old and had turned into what Hilary's mother, Wuss, described as a happy puker. My mother-in-law has always been known as Wuss. No one is quite sure why. He had picked up the rather mystifying habit of making himself vomit, sometimes by mistake, as he was very intolerant of lumps in his food, or more alarmingly, deliberately by shoving a finger down his throat and then roaring with laughter when he had achieved the desired effect. Worryingly, these exorcist moments seemed to have become a regular part of his repertoire, and no doctor or priest could do anything about the happy puking, so for a while we were stuck with it. On arrival at their house, Hilary had asked Anita if she could feed Jack before we sat down for lunch, so as to chop out at least one potential type of vomiting that might be caused by a stray lump in his food. Jack having successfully finished, the rest of us sat down for our lunch. The party consisted of Hilary and me, Brooke and Anita, and their 2 children, then aged 6 and 8. Anita had pulled out all the stops, crystal wine glasses, the best silver, the Villeroy and Bosch, and all atop the whitest and crispest of linen tablecloths. As the last bottom hit its chair, Jack looked around the table, laughed, shoved his finger down his throat, and projectile vomited right across the table, turning his head as he did so, although fortunately less than 360 degrees, thereby creating a travelling arc of vomit that covered the entire table. As he finished, he roared with laughter, as did the Land children. For the first time, but certainly not the last, Hilary was speechless. Although Anita dealt with this crisis seamlessly, and indeed we have remained very good friends with them ever since, they have never invited us to lunch again, not even without the human sprinkler.
Have you ever stopped to think that the puking may have been a cry for help? That in fact it was not happy puking, but unhappy puking, or not doted upon enough as a baby puking? Just saying.
Your mother doted on you more than any mother would ever have doted on a child.
So, blame the father.
Happily, he eventually grew out of this particular idiosyncrasy.
Someone's been a thesaurus.
But we were still left with another Jack gastroenterological-based oddity.
And again.
Yes. But we were still left with another Jack gastroenterological-based oddity, inasmuch as he suffered from another complaint, which this time was diagnosed as toddler diarrhea, although perhaps happy shitter might have been more appropriate. This meant that Jack produced nappies that were not only explosive, but unpredictable and nuclear in their power and aroma. Hilary was expecting again.
Why is Mummy always pregnant in these stories?
I was at my most potent.
Oh, God.
And with Jack just 8 months old, was unable to change his nappies as she suffered from bad morning sickness that seemed to last for most of the day. I therefore stepped into the breach and took on this particular duty. By the time he was a year old, Jack had also perfected getting his nappy open before I was awake and spreading its contents over the bars of his cot. I believe a not dissimilar procedure was employed by disgruntled IRA inmates at the Maze prison in Belfast. Our solution to Jack's dirty protest was to sellotape him into his nappy several times around his waist before he went to bed. Therefore, the most important piece of equipment for the early morning nappy was a pair of scissors to cut him free. Scissors were not relevant when we had lunch at the Carlton Towers Hotel Knightsbridge with our friends Sid and Phoebe Goldstein, who were visiting from the USA. Sid was an eminent cardiologist on the London leg of a European lecture tour with his wife, who was scouring the West End art dealers for interesting additions to their modern art collection. During lunch, it became apparent that Jack had had some toxic activity in the nappy department, and as Hilary was deep in conversation, catching up on all the family gossip, I decided swift action was required and headed off to the loo with Jack and the changing bag. Unfortunately, having removed the offending nappy and revealed the mayhem thereunder, I discovered that the changing bag had not been replenished from the previous day. My only option was to construct a temporary arrangement out of paper towels, and as I was attempting to do this, two hooray men, who were clearly in the middle of a very liquid lunch, came into the loo. "You've certainly got your hands full, haven't you, old boy?" said one of them. "Actually, I wonder if you could do me a great favour. I'm not going to be able to cope with this on my own, and my wife is sitting at the table by the window over there with two other people. Could you tell her to come in here and lend me a hand?" "No problem, old boy," said one of the men, clearly unlike me, finding the whole thing a big laugh. Moments later the door slowly opened, and I lifted Jack up and shoved him bottom first towards Hilary. "I really can't cope with this. Over to you." "I beg your pardon?" I peered round Jack. It was not Hilary, but a middle-aged, balding man in a pinstripe suit who looked far from pleased with being presented with the stinking backside of a baby. So much for the two men finding Hilary for me. "I'm profusely sorry," I said to the man, "but I thought you were my wife," which not unsurprisingly didn't totally put him at ease. After he'd left, I rinsed through Jack's soiled dungarees, and I presented a pristine baby back at the table, albeit with a Heath Robinson nappy in place. "You took your time," said Hilary. I could have killed her. I then spent the rest of my lunch trying to avoid eye contact with the balding man who was sitting directly opposite me, giving me very shifty looks. 7 years later, Jack, now joined by his brother and sister, continued to be a deadly house guest. But the actors Richard Pascoe and his wife Barbara Lee Hunt had asked us to spend the weekend with them and were insistent that we brought the children with us. Dickie and Bar, as everyone called them, lived in an enchanting thatched cottage covered in honeysuckle and roses in a village near Stratford-upon-Avon. There was a pretty cottage garden with meandering, crazy paved paths, and it was a picture postcard location. On arrival, we quickly realised that a major drawback from our point of view was that it was in no way a child-friendly place. At the time of our visit, Jack, Molly and Barnaby ranged from the ages of 4 to 8, so our house in Putney had been cleared of all objets d'art for the foreseeable future. The mice and figurines were hibernating in the cellar, and the fine bone china had been replaced by Thomas the Tank Engine and Disney Princess plastic mugs and plates. This was certainly not the case chez Pascoe. Bar was a collector, as was her husband, of things. Books, leather-bound, first editions down to rare theatrical folios, fine china, bronzes, paintings, large, small and very small, Victoriana, brass, glassware, jewellery, furniture, ornaments, clocks, walking sticks, silhouettes, silver boxes, decanters, dolls and dolls' houses, pens and inkwells.
It was basically like we'd walked into one of David Dickinson's wet dreams.
Empty surfaces were certainly not de rigueur at the Pascoe residence. Balls in china shops came quickly to mind. We had been invited for the weekend to arrive for tea on Friday and leave after breakfast on Sunday. It was a beautiful June afternoon as we squeezed past a precariously sited aspidistra sitting on an elegant black and gold plinth in the tiny hall. Bar showed us around. Delicately carved tables with chintz cloths piled high with books and other literary ephemera.
It's ephemera.
Books and other
Just do
literary
it again
ephemera.
and just concentrate. It's ephemera, not what you said. You got it wrong.
A tiny desk complete with quill pen and inkwell, ominously filled with black ink, and delicate vases of fresh flowers from the garden sitting on tiny and hazardous-looking stands. An antique dealer's dream, maybe, but for parents of young children, a total nightmare. Jack's bedroom was a cosy little room with a substantial collection of rare, hand-painted lead soldiers on a small oak sideboard. "These are definitely not for playing with," I warned Jack. The bedside table was made of walnut on which sat some delicate lacework. Jack had encountered fine lacework once before when we had weekended with my ex-sister-in-law, Fiona Armstrong, and her husband, John. Fiona was a successful interior decorator who'd been trained by David Hicks, and her arts and crafts house in Hampshire was a homage to good, if slightly over-the-top, taste. Hilary,
Who was probably pregnant,
had packed lots of distracting entertainments in the hope of keeping the children occupied and away from any potential crises with regard to breakages and damage. Jack was passionate about drawing, so there were several pads and lots of highly coloured felt pens in tow. He managed to leave the top off his black felt pen, which had left a very large stain on the lace work in his bedroom. Fortunately, Hilary's parents lived nearby and had also been asked for dinner. Hilary called her mother and asked her to bring some bleach with her, but in a disguised container. As Wuss greeted Fiona with a kiss, she passed the small Diet Coke bottle that had been concealed in her handbag to me, like some dodgy drug dealer. I then smuggled it upstairs in order to carry out the repair and renewal, thereby avoiding any unpleasantness. Some weeks later I had a concerned Fiona on the phone asking if Hilary was all right. It turned out that she'd found the empty Coke bottle whilst cleaning out her guest room and given it a sniff. I assured Fiona that my wife had not been smuggling alcohol into the house, but was forced to come clean about the mishap with the lacework.
Mummy did have a drinking problem at the time.
Back at the Pascoes, sitting on the delicate lacework, was an engraved cut-glass decanter filled with water, a matching glass by its side. Also on the table was a silk box filled with tissues. Next to it stood a scented candle and a box of matches. As we moved out of his room to continue the tour, I secretly pocketed the matches. Jack managed to attach himself to the box of tissues, but fortunately Hilary was in the slips, ready to catch them. "I need a tissue," said Jack. "They're my tissues." I checked him with a glance. "Later, Jack," I replied, as I gently put him into an arm lock.
An arm lock? In this chapter, you've put me into an arm lock and sellotaped me into a nappy.
You needed to be controlled.
Seriously, I'm calling Childline.
It's too late. You can only call Childline within 24 hours of being abused.
Why do you know that?
I just know. Hilary's and my room was beautifully sunny, and with a large double bed and a small single for Barnaby tucked in the corner, under a leaded window with a shelf below it. On the shelf was a collection of Victorian china farm animals. "We thought Barney would like those above his bed," said Bar. His bedside table was a replica of Jack's apart from his decanter, which was smaller and a lot more fragile looking. Hilary earmarked it for subsequent reciting. "Those farm animals are not like your Duplo farm set, Barnaby. Look, but don't touch, or you're out," I cautioned him. I was beginning to sound like a bouncer in a strip club.
Ugh, how would you know?
Molly's bed was in a cramped corridor with a long trailing plant covering the wall and 2 enormous vases of roses. Molly thought it looked like an indoor garden, and I reminded her that if she wanted a wee during the night, to remember that it wasn't.
Because, of course, at home, Molly is always going to the loo in the garden.
"Would everyone like some tea?" asked Dickie. As we sat in the deep button-back chairs, and the children took over the long sofa, Bar wheeled in an antique brass trolley piled high with scones, jam, cream, and a tall cake stand with an assortment of homemade pastries, a teapot in a woolen cosy, silver milk jug and sugar bowl, and 7 fine china cups and saucers. The centrepiece was a large plate of finger sandwiches that had been delicately piled high like a Jenga tower, a game that was very popular with the children at the time.
Still is.
It teetered dangerously as she wheeled it in, and you could tell that if one wrong sandwich was taken out of the structure, the whole thing would come tumbling down in a demolition disaster of cream cheese and cucumber. There then followed an angst-ridden hour, with Hilary playing a hazardous version of musical chairs as she darted from child to child, preventing chunks of Bar's home-baked walnut cake being trodden into the Persian rugs underfoot. At one stage, Molly's ponytail became entangled in a large dollop of Bar's homemade strawberry jam, sitting precariously on a mound of double cream atop Jack's scone, which Hilary had to deal with quickly, utilising a starched linen napkin before Molly spread it onto the back of the pale-coloured sofa. "Jack's a lively boy," said Bar, as I scooped up a large Delft porcelain bowl filled with potpourri, which had inexplicably been put on the table next to the cake stand, and which Jack hadn't noticed as he reached for his third chocolate eclair. "But he's certainly got a good appetite." I watched him intently as the cream and chocolate began to cover his hands and realised of all Bar's delicacies on offer, this was definitely the most lethal, as the eclair contains materials of potential stainage both within and without. Once the tea had been removed and Hilary had been able to breathe a sigh of relief, peace broke out as Dickie switched on the TV. Hilary then proudly produced her new Sony mini camcorder, which she had bought a couple of days earlier with the money that her mother had generously given her as a birthday present. It was the first time out of the box, and Hilary studied the instruction manual with relish while the children watched the Chuckle Brothers, one of Jack's special favourites then and indeed now.
Yeah, so what?
For readers of my generation who are not familiar with their body of work, the Chuckle Brothers are, to my mind, a vastly inferior version of Laurel and Hardy.
How dare you? Seriously? Inferior Laurel and Hardy? Yeah, more like Rochdale's answer to Morecambe and Wise. Barry and Paul are two of the finest comic actors of their generation, and to my mind, not just comic actors, because I see Chucklevision as more of a comedy drama. Paul Chuckle, in particular, is an enigmatic screen presence. He can turn you from laughter to tears with one flick of that trademark moustache. You're just bitter because you probably tried to sign them once. Don't ever badmouth the Chuckle Brothers again. Continue.
In the particular episode, Jack was watching, the mustachioed duo were performing a sketch in which they clumsily attempted to carry a large antique mirror up a flight of stairs. I gave Jack a "don't get any ideas" look.
Oh, classic episode.
The following day, the much-admired camera was in constant use as we wandered around Stratford-on-Avon seeing the sights. It was a relief to spend some time in a child-friendly environment, although Anne Hathaway's cottage,
2 hours of my life I'll never get back,
was a bit of a struggle. Feeding the ducks on the Avon was an easier task and very photogenic. On Sunday morning, Bar had laid out one of her special breakfasts, fresh duck eggs from the farm opposite, locally dry-cured bacon from the butcher in the village, some of his award-winning organic sausages, tomatoes from her kitchen garden, and even some home-grown mushrooms. "I'll just have some tea and toast, thanks, Bar. I don't really do breakfast," I said, and added, as I saw Jack, Molly and Barnaby starting to salivate, "and nor do the children." For me, the very thought of Jack getting his hands on rashers of greasy bacon, runny eggs and bouncy sausages, not to mention the squeezy ketchup container, was beyond the pale. Hilary, who was trying to keep on top of her diet, shot me a withering look as she knew that she was now duty-bound to eat her way through every element of Bar's breakfast. The children unhappily munched their way through a couple of slices of toast. We started to pack up for our return to London, and I gave the children a big hug.
For hug, read firm handshake.
I'm very proud of you three. You've done really well. Dickie and Bar were also travelling up to London that morning, so as we loaded up our car, they began to close up the cottage. As I looked through into the kitchen, I saw a small white terrier hovering by the Aga. I didn't know you had a dog, I said. We don't, said Bar. Dickie, that bloody dog from up the lane, is in the kitchen. After much shouting and shooing, it hurtled out of the front door and ran up the lane. By now, Hilary was walking the children to the car and carrying, amongst other things, the prized video camera. Let me carry that for you, insisted Dickie. I caught a waft of the unmistakable aroma of dog poo. The dog had left a large turd on the tiled kitchen floor, and Dickie had managed to tread it in and walk it through the house. Dickie, there is dog poo everywhere now. Have you trodden in it? Bar asked accusingly. As he attempted to wipe the poo off the sole of his shoe, the camera slipped out of his hand and smashed onto the flagstone patio. And it didn't just smash, the whole front of the camera sheared off, and as Dickie picked it up, fragments detached themselves and pinged onto the dog poo-smeared ground. Ashen-faced, Dickie burbled an apology as he handed Hilary what remained of the camera. I'm so sorry, Hilary. I cannot believe what I've just done. Jack looked at him, clearly thinking that while he had avoided a single breakage over 2 days, Dickie had managed to smash a camera that Hilary had only had out of the box for less than 24 hours. Don't worry, Dickie, said Hilary. We can easily get it fixed. Accidents happen. Bad enough having dog poo in your kitchen, I said, in an attempt to put a positive spin on things, but even worse if it's someone else's dog. No, I insist on paying, Hilary said. Let me know how much it's going to cost to repair and I'll send you a cheque. I didn't think we'd get through the weekend without any breakages, I said to Hilary as we drove off, waving our goodbyes, but I certainly didn't think the breakages would be on their side. By the time we got to the motorway, Hilary was looking decidedly peaky. You're not upset about the camera, are you? I asked her. No, it's not the camera, but I think there was something very dodgy about that duck egg. Can you pull into this service station?
Probably morning sickness.
Chapter 8. High Jinks. During the interval of the Marlborough College production of Peter Weiss's The Persecution and Assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, as performed by the inmates of the asylum of Charenton under the direction of the Marquis de Sade, known for short, fortunately, as Marat Sade, I had a chat with the headmaster. He clearly didn't feel it was appropriate for a play of this sort to be done at the school, nor indeed did I, especially as we were sitting in the front row watching Jack, then aged 14, and his chums writhing around on the floor, simulating sex.
We were fighting.
He was playing one of the inmates, a part with no dialogue, but a lot of rolling around.
Fighting.
At a supper party after the play, I mentioned to the headmaster, Edward Gould, that I was producing Terence Rattigan's The Winslow Boy, with Edward Fox playing Arthur Winslow and Simon Ward as Sir Robert Morton, which was shortly to visit Bath before coming to London. Now that's much more my cup of tea than this dreadful rubbish we've had to endure for the last couple of hours, said the headmaster. Mr. Gould was a stickler for good behaviour, and up to this point in his time at Marlborough, Jack had failed to impress on this front. Indeed, a recent stunt involving fake tan and a school election was still fresh in the memory. I'd been trying to get him on side for some time, and as the Marat Sade supper party was drawing to a close, I was handed a top trumps card by Mrs. Gould. Edward tells me that you're producing The Winslow Boy. I love Rattigan. Well, we're playing Bath in a few weeks' time, and I'd love to give you a couple of tickets for the show, I replied. Oh, that would be so wonderful, and you have Edward Fox in it too, she said, another great favourite of mine. How exciting. A A few weeks later, we headed off to Bath, having arranged to stay the night with the parents of one of Jack's school friends, Archie, en route. The Maynards, a trendy couple with a rambling Elizabethan manor house near Stroud, whom we'd never met before, were keen for us to stay overnight with them and bring Jack with us. We had planned to stay at the Royal Crescent Hotel in Bath, as I was not a fan of sleeping in strange people's houses, but Jack wanted to be with Archie, so we accepted the invite to shut him up. We arrived in time for dinner just as Hilary announced to me that she felt quite ill and thought she had a temperature. Great timing, I thought. Our hosts, Johnny and Rosie, showed us into a very ethnic-looking guest room with an enormous double bed covered in cream silk netting and a lot of smouldering scented candles and incense sticks littered around the beamed bedroom and bathroom.
Much like my parents' bedroom at home.
Dinner was a vegetarian affair with all my least favourite things. Curried aubergine, a lot of mushy, spicy stuff in bowls.
Hummus.
All washed down with a local West Country organic white wine, which was thoroughly unpleasant, as was the whole meal. The centrepiece was a hot suet crust vegetable pie, a dish I had encountered only once before at a dinner party in London a year or so previously. Our hosts on that occasion were the Hammonds, a deeply unattractive couple with 6 children. Why do unattractive people always have so many children?
Maybe they're trying to get a good-looking one and just gave up after 6.
Whom we dined with just the once. Having been served a large portion of the dreaded and very dry vegetable pie, I quickly realised that I was not going to get it down. Help, however, was at hand in the form of their large Alsatian, which was neatly poised under the dining room table right in front of my feet. I was sitting next to Mrs. Hammond, and as she stood up to offer the other guests second helpings of her ghastly pie, I slipped mine under the table and pushed it into the dog's mouth. "Well, you certainly enjoyed that," said Mrs. Hammond as she cleared my plate. "Delicious," I replied. At this point there was a retching sound under the table, and there, sitting at my feet, was a wet, regurgitated lump of vegetable mess as the dog padded off into the next room. Avoiding Mrs. Hammond's eye, I grabbed the remains and put them into my jacket pocket. By now it had a very foul smell emanating from it. Why do people say vegetarian food is good for you? Visit the recently occupied lavatory of a vegetarian and savour the gassy aromas of lentils, legumes and brassicas, and you'll realise it isn't. As I left the house, I reached into my pocket to get my car keys and discovered that they had lodged themselves into the middle of the now dissolved pie, and I was unable to shake Mr. Hammond's hand, as mine was now covered in the vegetarian mush. So I was forced to go for a very theatrical kiss and one-armed hug, which I think surprised him, as we had only met that evening, and I couldn't even remember his name. I ate what I could of the Maynard's pie in Stroud. Hilary's flu was beginning to kick in, and she had a violent sneezing attack. "I think you're ready for bed, Hilary," I said to her, standing up from the table. I was keen that she had a good night's sleep and was on top form for the Gould's suck-up evening the following night. I was then conscious of a lot of chopping happening on the sideboard, which I assumed was some kind of exotic dessert being prepared by our host. "We know what you London media folk are like. I'm getting some post-dinner goodies ready for you," said Johnny. He appeared to be using his credit card as part of this process, which seemed very strange to me, as indeed did the fact that he was doing the whole thing on a mirror. "I'm just doing a couple of lines for us," he said. The penny dropped. My experience of drugs was extremely limited, and indeed I had caused some embarrassment at the old Evening News Film Awards, when a young actress handed me a badly rolled, strange-smelling cigarette, which I put out in the ashtray in front of us, and she didn't seem at all pleased.
Wow, it's like train spotting.
And on another occasion, a helpful friend told me that my orgasms—
Oh God, I don't like where this is going.
—would reach the summit of excitement if I inhaled something called amyl nitrate at the appropriate moment.
Oh God.
He even gave me a small supply of files of the stuff to get me started. It was all a total disaster. As I was attempting to grab the thing off the bedside table, it slipped out of my hand, rolled under my bottom, and I heard a crack. "What is that disgusting smell?" asked my companion. No peaks of excitement there then. I was also bleeding, as I hadn't realised the thing was glass, and by the time the sheets had been changed and the bed put back to normal, the passion had long since sapped away.
Passion?
However, the bleeding continued, so I made a cautionary late-night visit to the Chelsea and Westminster A&E, and having admitted to using amyl nitrate, or more specifically, not using it, I got some very strange looks from the duty nurse. Poppers, as the nurse referred to them, and an injured bottom seemed to cause a lot of eyebrows to be raised, for some reason.
That is the most disturbing passage of prose I have ever heard.
Actually, I'm going to have to leave it. We've got an early start in the morning, but thanks anyway, I told Johnny. "Overdid it last night, eh?" he said. As I headed upstairs, I heard our host trying to persuade Hilary to join them. "I'll tell you what will clear up that flu of yours," said Johnny. "Some shisha. I don't like raw fish."
That's sushi, you idiot.
So I continued up to bed. Unbeknownst to me, with much reluctance and in the face of persistent persuasion, and being a polite girl, Hilary accepted his invitation in the hope that it would shut our host up, and indeed might even make her feel better. Mrs. Whitehall is very naive in these matters, unlike myself. Little did she know exactly what she was letting herself in for, as it wasn't until she'd been puffing away on the shisha pipe for 20 minutes that Johnny started bragging that it contained the finest Nepalese skunk.
It's not stunk, it's skunk.
How do you know?
I've been told.
I went to the bedroom, hit my head on a low beam between the bedroom and the ensuite bathroom going in and coming out, and settled down in bed reading a copy of Madonna's erotic coffee table book Sex, which our host had thoughtfully left on the bedside table next to copies of Country Life and House and Garden. Having dozed off for half an hour or so, I was awoken by Hilary's sudden arrival back in the room. "You're having a late one," I said. "Shh," she hissed. "Get out of bed and look for bugs." This seemed to me an odd suggestion in the middle of the night. It wasn't a particularly hot night, and we were, after all, in Wiltshire, not Calcutta, despite what the decor might have implied. "The room's bugged. They're listening to us. Close the windows," she said, as she disappeared under the bed. Having been woken up so abruptly, I was now desperate for a wee, so I headed off to the bathroom, hitting my head on a beam again. "Those fucking beams! Yes, that's it. Check the beams," said Hilary, reappearing from under the bed. "That's a very common place for hiding bugs." Hilary had suddenly become an authority on the location of surveillance equipment. "What are you talking about? What's all this about?" I barked. At which point there was a loud knocking on the door. "Don't let them in," Hilary said. "They're coming for us. Get into bed. Pretend we're asleep." Ignoring the advice, I opened the door, and there stood Jack in his pyjamas and dressing gown. "I can't sleep, and Archie snores," he said. "Please can I come and sleep on your sofa?" I thought in the circumstances it would be better if Jack stayed in his own room. I didn't want him to see his mother in what appeared to be the advanced stages of a drug overdose. Not that I was a great expert in these matters. I walked him back to his room, and when I returned, Hilary was looking even more frantic, scanning beneath the loo seat for concealed radio transmitters. I returned to the bed. "I'm going downstairs to find something to eat. I'm starving," she said. "I'm not surprised," I said, "after that ghastly dinner." "I'll be back in a minute," she replied. 10 minutes later, she returned with quantities of foul-smelling, cold vegetable fritters, a handful of olives, and a weird, foreign-looking crisp.
A poppadom.
She got into bed and started munching through them, dropping crumbs everywhere. "Why didn't you eat them in the kitchen?" I asked. "I was frightened that they might have taken me," she said. "Taken you? Taken you where, for fuck's sake?" I was beginning to lose it. And then she fell into a deep sleep and kept me awake by shivering, sneezing, and sleep-talking for the rest of the night. When I went down for breakfast the following morning, without Hilary, who had opted to have a much-needed lie-in, Johnny and Rosie had disappeared, and Jack and I were entertained by the elderly housekeeper. Over breakfast, Jack's friend Archie apologised for his parents' absence. "I'm so sorry they're not here to say goodbye to you. This always happens after my dad's been on a bender." Jack explained to me that the word bender now meant an evening of excess and not what it had meant in my day, which was a relief, as I was beginning to wonder about Johnny's activities the previous night and what Rosie would have made of it all. I certainly didn't have him down as someone who picked lilacs in the springtime. Hilary woke up at about midday and seemed a little worse for wear, but assured me it was nothing that a shower and a cup of coffee couldn't sort out. By the time we set off for Bath at 5 o'clock, she seemed to have pulled it together, notwithstanding the original flu symptoms which were still present. We met the Goulds in the foyer before the play. "Hilary, Michael, how lovely to see you," said Mr. Gould. Hilary went in for a kiss, and I plonked one on his wife's cheek.
I beg your pardon?
What's wrong with that?
I plonked one on his wife's cheek?
Yes.
What the fuck is that? Please, under no circumstances use the phrase...
I kissed his wife on the cheek.
Yeah, that's not what it sounds like. Please never again use the phrase plonked one on her cheek.
Drinks and programmes were awaiting our arrival, and during the interval we shared a bottle of champagne. They were pleasantly surprised that Jack had joined us. "Jack loves Rattigan," I told Mr. Gould. "Don't you, darling?" I gave Jack one of my "if you let me down on this one, I'll kill you" looks. He didn't. "Yes, I really do, sir," he said to the headmaster, "and a lot more than Peter Weiss." After the play had finished, we took the Goulds backstage and bumped into Simon Ward on our way to Edward's dressing room, so we had a brief chat with him. "Oh, what an extra treat to meet young Winston. It's one of my all-time favourite films," said Jane excitedly. Naturally, we didn't tell a soul about what had taken place the previous night, but while we were in Bath, we did buy a picture called Head Cases as a memento of our bizarre trip to Wiltshire, which now hangs in our kitchen next to Hilary's spice rack.
I think this chapter serves to teach us a valuable lesson. Kids, don't do drugs. But more importantly, adults, please don't do them either.